You ever notice how some of the smartest people you know can believe the strangest things? Like the engineer who swears the moon landing was staged, or the award-winning professor who insists their political tribe has never made a mistake in history. That tension between brilliance and blindness is where today's conversation lives. Welcome to the Ideology Trap. I'm Ash, and this season we're unpacking ideas from Daniel Flynn's provocative book, Intellectual Morons, How Ideology Makes Smart People Fall for Stupid Ideas. With me is John, whose writing explores how our convictions shape the way we see reality.
Hey Ash, great to be here. This topic hits a nerve because Flynn isn't just roasting the other side, he's warning everyone. The smarter you are, the more skilled you become at lying to yourself.
Exactly. Let's start with a case that still blows my mind, literally, since it involves a physicist. In 1956, William Shockley, co-inventor of the transistor, was at the height of scientific fame. He'd built the foundation for modern electronics, and yet, within a few years, he was publicly arguing for eugenics, claiming certain groups should have fewer children to protect the gene pool. It's tragic and also fascinating. How does a Nobel-winning genius slide from invention to ideology?
Flynn would say it's not about intelligence, it's about identity. Shockley's self-image as a rational savior became part of the ideology. Once your intellect is tied to your moral mission, you can't afford to be wrong, so you start defending the mission at any cost.
That's the key, isn't it? The smarter we are, the harder we work to protect our image of being smart.
Exactly. It's a kind of intellectual narcissism, and ideology feeds it because it offers certainty. Certainty feels righteous. It tells you, you're not just correct, you're virtuous. That's intoxicating, especially for high achievers who've built their lives around being right.
Which makes ideology less like a theory and more like a faith. Flynn actually calls it a substitute religion, something that promises moral clarity without the inconvenience of doubt.
Yeah, it gives you the feeling of understanding the world, but it's a prefab understanding. And once you adopt it, you stop asking whether your ideas still match reality. You start asking whether reality still matches your ideas.
That reversal. That's the moment the trap shuts.
Totally. We think ideology is about content. Left, right, green, libertarian. But Flynn's insight is structural. It's the same psychological machinery across all tribes. He writes that ideology makes smart people stupid, not because it erases knowledge, but because it repurposes it. Intelligence becomes the lawyer defending the client of belief.
And maybe that's the scariest part. Because you don't feel delusional, you feel enlightened. You feel like the last rational person in an irrational world.
Right. And once you hit that mindset, every challenge feels like persecution. Every correction feels like censorship. You start curating your facts, your friends, even your vocabulary, until you're basically living inside a mental gated community.
So, if ideology is this powerful, what is it exactly? Because people throw that word around. Ideological? Ideologue. But we rarely stop to define it.
Let's make it simple. Ideology is a story that pretends to be data. It's a narrative about good and evil that masquerades as reason and evidence. You can spot it because it gives you emotional satisfaction faster than it gives you understanding.
That's brilliant. So the red flag isn't anger or passion, it's comfort. When an idea makes you feel too comfortable, that's when you should start asking questions.
Exactly. Flynn says ideology supplies certainty in a world that rewards doubt. But here's the twist. Doubt is the engine of progress. Without it, science stalls, democracy rots, and personal growth freezes. So in chasing certainty, we actually trade away the very thing that made us intelligent to begin with: curiosity.
There's a line I underlined from the book. The smarter the mind, the cleverer the excuses. It's chilling, and also kind of liberating, because it means none of us are immune, but we can catch ourselves.
Absolutely. The danger isn't having beliefs. It's believing your beliefs are above questioning.
Coming up, or rather, as we keep talking, let's trace how ideology recruits the bright mind, how smart people move from curiosity to conviction to crusade.
And how, once you start feeling righteous, it's almost impossible to tell when you've crossed the line.
You mentioned earlier that ideology doesn't start with stupidity. It starts with identity. I think Flynn's introduction drives that home. He says, when you let ideology be your guide, you're bound to get lost. And that line hits me because it's not just politics. It's culture. It's academia. It's even science.
That's right. Flynn opens the book by saying, ideology deludes, breeds fanaticism, and inspires dishonesty, all while feeling noble. That's what makes it so tricky. The person inside it thinks they're defending truth, but they're actually defending a worldview that stopped evolving.
He calls them intellectual morons, but he's not mocking their IQ. He's talking about people who've handed over their intellectual independence to some system. Marxism, libertarianism, radical feminism, whatever the flavor. They let the system think for them.
Right. And Flynn writes that when you submit to a guru or let a system predetermine your views, you put your brain on autopilot. That's the real crime here, the abdication of thought.
That's such a vivid image. Autopilot. The plane's still moving. The gauges look fine, but there's no one really flying.
That is true. And the higher the altitude, the smarter the person, the bigger the crash when ideology takes over.
So what makes the recruitment possible? I mean, how do bright people, scientists, artists, intellectuals, get pulled in?
It starts small. Flynn implies that ideology gives something we all crave: clarity. The world's chaotic, facts conflict, morality's messy. Ideology says, relax, I have the answer. For smart people, that's like catnip. We crave patterns, coherence, a grand narrative that explains everything.
So, the first step is comfort. You find a system that makes the noise stop.
Exactly. Step 1 is emotional. Step 2 is social. Once you join a movement or tribe, you're rewarded for loyalty. You get approval, belonging, maybe even fame. And then comes step 3, intellectual self-deception. You start editing reality to protect that comfort and belonging.
Flynn talks about the Rosetta Stone of everything. Ideology gives stock answers for every question. It's efficient, but sterile.
And dangerous, because once you think you've found a Rosetta Stone, you stop decoding anything new. You've solved life's puzzle. That's why he says, it doesn't matter how smart you are if you don't use your mind. Intelligence becomes irrelevant without curiosity.
That's brutal. And true. There's something poetic in the irony. The people who most pride themselves on thinking are the ones most likely to stop doing it once they find a cause they love.
It's the intellectual version of falling in love. You don't reason your way into it. You just feel it's right. Flynn actually opens with a quote from Arthur Koestler. A faith is not acquired by reasoning. Reason may defend an act of faith, but only after the act has been committed. That line nails it. Reason becomes the lawyer for belief, not the judge.
So we all have a little lawyer in our heads, defending our favorite beliefs against evidence.
Yep. The smarter the lawyer, the better the defense. And in the age of algorithms, where every belief gets mirrored back to us, that lawyer works overtime.
That's a terrifying thought. Our intellect serving as PR for our delusions.
And Flynn's warning is timeless. Ideology isn't just an intellectual mistake, it's a moral one, because it replaces honesty with loyalty.
Wow. It replaces honesty with loyalty. That's a line worth repeating. All right, let's keep this going. We've talked about how ideology seduces smart people. Next, let's get into what happens after the conversion, how it rewards them, protects them, and slowly imprisons them.
Yeah, that's when the true believer stops being a thinker and becomes a missionary.
So we've seen how ideology seduces the mind with comfort and clarity. But once someone's inside, Once they've joined the cause, something deeper happens. It stops being about ideas and starts being about status.
Exactly. Flynn hints that every ideological movement has its own internal economy. The currency isn't money or truth, it's loyalty. The more you repeat the catechism, the higher your rank in the moral hierarchy.
That's fascinating, almost like a social game. You start by admiring an idea and end up protecting it like a brand.
Yeah. Think of academia, activism, even tech culture. When you're rewarded for signaling virtue or group alignment, dissent feels like heresy. In that environment, even the smartest people learn to self-censor, not because they've been silenced, but because they've been domesticated.
That's chilling. Domesticated thinkers. Flynn calls these people joiners, intellectuals who trade independence for belonging. They don't ask, "Is this true?" They ask, "Will my tribe still like me if I say this?"
And here's the tragic twist. The more intelligent you are, the better you become at camouflaging conformity as originality. You quote Nietzsche or Foucault, you write complex essays, but you're still echoing the party line.
So ideology becomes a kind of echo chamber for the educated. It flatters you while quietly hollowing you out.
Yep. Flynn argues that these pseudo-intellectuals replace curiosity with conviction. He writes, ideology preordains your reaction to issues, ideas, and people. In other words, before reality even speaks, the ideologue already knows the answer.
And the terrifying part is, that feels like intelligence. You feel decisive, confident, certain, while actually running a preloaded script.
Right. It's like predictive text for your opinions. You think you're composing your worldview, but the algorithm, ideology, is doing it for you.
That's such a perfect analogy. And if we think about it psychologically, ideology offers 3 rewards that keep the trap shut. First, moral purity. You feel righteous. Second, belonging. You feel supported. And third, simplicity. You feel in control. Who doesn't want those?
Exactly. Flynn's warning is that when those rewards start replacing truth, you've crossed from thinking into believing. And once you've started believing, evidence becomes irrelevant. You'll twist it, deny it, or redefine it to save the faith.
That's where confirmation bias becomes self-esteem management. It's not about proving what's true. It's about protecting who you are.
And that's why ideology's grip on intelligent people is so strong. The smarter you are, the more your identity is tied to your intellect. So, admitting you're wrong feels like dying a little.
Right? There's an ego component. Being right isn't just a position, it's your personality. So to question the belief feels like betraying yourself.
Exactly. Flynn's true believer isn't evil. He's terrified. Terrified of being wrong, of being excluded, of being ordinary. That fear is the emotional engine behind every fanatic.
That makes me wonder. Maybe ideology doesn't just hijack intelligence, it hijacks meaning. It fills the existential void with certainty.
Beautifully said. Ideology is a meaning machine. It churns out purpose at wholesale prices. But the more meaning it produces, the less truth it tolerates.
That's the paradox, right? Meaning without truth becomes delusion. Truth without meaning becomes despair. The wise mind keeps them in balance.
Exactly. And that's why Flynn's critique matters. He's not mocking belief. He's defending thinking itself.
That's such an important distinction. He's anti-pseudo-intellectual, not anti-intellectual. He's saying, if you claim to think for a living, then think. Don't outsource it to ideology. Let's go deeper into that. Once someone's fully converted, when the belief system becomes their identity, how do they handle contradictions? Because reality doesn't always cooperate.
They don't handle it. They rationalize it. Flynn says ideology trains people to reinterpret failure as proof of persecution. If the system collapses, it's not because the idea was wrong. It's because the world wasn't ready.
That's genius, in a tragic way. Every disconfirmation becomes confirmation.
Exactly. And that's how intelligent people can support disastrous regimes, defend failed theories, or excuse cruelty because the narrative tells them it's all for the greater good.
That's where morality gets twisted. The ends justify the ideology.
And that's when smart people stop being thinkers and start being crusaders.
You just called them crusaders. And I think that's the perfect word. Once a person believes they're fighting for moral truth, anything becomes excusable. Flynn calls this the moral inversion of ideology. Evil actions committed in the name of good.
Exactly. And he traces that pattern across history. You see it in Stalin's intellectual defenders, in Mao's Western admirers, in movements that justified violence or censorship because the cause was pure. These weren't fools. They were professors, journalists, artists, the kind of people who should have known better.
Flynn says, ideologues forego independent judgment in favor of having their views handed to them. That's chilling, because it's not stupidity. It's surrender.
Right. The moment you surrender judgment, morality becomes mechanical. You're just performing virtue instead of practicing it.
And the irony is, ideology often recruits people with the strongest moral instincts, the ones who care the most.
Exactly. It hijacks compassion. Flynn notes that the true believer's strength isn't ignorance, it's passion. They feel injustice so intensely that they stop questioning their tools for fighting it.
So outrage becomes a moral currency. The more indignant you are, the more righteous you appear.
Yes, and that emotional economy rewards performative anger. In Flynn's terms, facts, experience, and logic are replaced by what feels morally satisfying. And once outrage becomes identity, you can't back down, because calmness would feel like betrayal.
That hits close to home in our era of online debates and tribal politics. It's not about persuasion anymore. It's about purity.
Exactly. Flynn would say we've democratized ideology. Where 20th century intellectuals clung to utopian manifestos, we cling to hashtags and moral branding. Different scale, same psychology.
It's fascinating. He wrote this book 20 years ago, but it reads like a diagnosis of social media today. He was warning that when belief becomes spectacle, intelligence turns theatrical.
Yes, he says that ideologues defer to systems of belief and charismatic gurus for their ideas. In the past, that guru might have been Marx or Freud. Today, it's a viral influencer or algorithm. Different pulpits, same sermon.
That's such a good point. And you can almost see the psychological arc. First, ideology offers belonging. Then, it offers identity. Finally, it demands obedience.
Exactly. And each stage feels like growth. When you first join, you feel enlightened. When you preach, you feel empowered. Only later do you realize you've stopped listening.
It's like being trapped in a mirror maze. Every reflection looks like truth, until you bump into the glass.
That's a beautiful image. Flynn would probably add that breaking the glass hurts, which is why most people never do it. They'd rather live inside the distortion than face the shock of seeing themselves clearly.
That's heavy. It reminds me of that Arthur Koestler quote he opens with, "A faith is not acquired by reasoning." You don't argue your way into ideology, you fall into it. And reason shows up later, like a lawyer building the defense.
Exactly. And once you're defending faith instead of examining facts, you're not an intellectual. You're a missionary.
Which explains why Flynn calls this book an anti-pseudo-intellectual manifesto. He's not attacking intelligence, he's rescuing it from self-worship.
Yes, because genuine intelligence is humble. It's aware of its blind spots. Ideology pretends to be enlightenment, but it's really arrogance in costume.
And the cost of that arrogance isn't just personal, it's cultural. When the smartest voices in a society stop thinking independently, the whole conversation collapses into slogans.
Exactly. And once slogans replace ideas, fanaticism replaces progress.
That's a good place to pause, not in the podcast, but in our reflection. Because next, I want to ask, what does it take to break free? How do you deprogram yourself from a worldview that flatters your ego, rewards your virtue, and punishes your doubt?
That's the ultimate question Flynn leaves us with. Escaping ideology isn't about intellect, it's about courage.
You said something earlier that stuck with me. That escaping ideology isn't about intellect, it's about courage. That's counterintuitive, right? We tend to think the way out is through better arguments, more data, smarter reasoning.
Exactly, but Flynn would say the real escape hatch is humility. He ends his book reminding us that thinking for yourself is an act of bravery because it means standing alone without the safety net of a movement, a label, or a cheering crowd.
That's tough in practice. We like to imagine that being independent means being confident, but it's actually lonely. Flynn warns that once you drop the ideological scaffolding, you're left with uncertainty. And most people will do anything to avoid that feeling.
Right. He's echoing an old philosophical truth. Intellectual honesty starts where comfort ends. It takes humility to say, I might be wrong, and courage to live in that sentence long enough to find out.
Which is why humility isn't weakness, it's a discipline. It's the moment you admit that your brain, no matter how sharp, can't see the full picture. I think that's what separates the real intellectuals from the pseudo-intellectuals Flynn criticizes. One group seeks truth, the other seeks applause.
Exactly. And it's not just external applause, it's the inner applause, that smug satisfaction of being on the right side. That's what humility dismantles. It's the only solvent strong enough to dissolve ideology because it refuses to idolize your own mind.
That's profound. Humility as the antidote to idolatry of intellect. And courage, then, is what keeps you from running back to the comfort of certainty.
Right. Courage doesn't mean shouting louder, it means thinking slower. Flynn's point is that fanaticism thrives on speed, on reflex. Independent thought needs patience, to pause before reacting, to question even the question.
That's a radical thought in an attention economy world. We live in a culture that rewards the instant opinion. Hot takes, quick reactions. Humility and courage don't trend well.
They don't, but they endure. Flynn's final warning is that when society stops valuing independent thought, ideology fills the vacuum. But when individuals practice humility and courage, they become, in his words, intellectually inoculated.
So the real battle isn't between left and right, science or religion. It's between curiosity and conviction.
Exactly. Flynn says truth isn't everyone's destination. For ideologues, the destination is victory. But for thinkers, for people who stay curious, the journey is the destination.
That's such a powerful takeaway. Humility keeps you searching. Courage keeps you honest. And together, they're the only defense against becoming an intellectual moron yourself. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one final thing. If someone listening today suspects they're caught in an ideology, maybe political, maybe personal, what's one small thing they can do to start breaking free?
Ask yourself this question every time you feel righteous. What evidence would make me change my mind? If the answer is nothing, you're not thinking, you're believing. That single self-check can reboot your entire mental operating system.
That's so simple and devastating, because most of us don't have an answer.
Right, and that silence is the start of wisdom.
That's a perfect place to close this conversation, but not the thought process. Flynn's work reminds us that intellect without humility is just ego with good grammar, and that every time we trade thinking for certainty, we shrink a little inside.
Beautifully said.
Thanks, John, for joining me in this deep dive. Next time, we'll explore Flynn's second chapter, the strange story of Alfred Kinsey and how science became a mask for ideology. You know, I keep circling back to that one line from Flynn. It doesn't matter how smart you are if you don't use your mind. That could be the motto for the whole season. Because when you really sit with it, it's not just a critique of intellectuals. It's a mirror for everyone listening.
Exactly. Flynn doesn't want readers to sneer at the other side. He's saying, look in the mirror. We're all a little ideological, all tempted by the comfort of being right. The difference is whether we admit it.
Right. The test isn't whether we have beliefs. We all do. The test is whether we can re-examine them without panic. Because the moment your worldview feels sacred, you've stopped learning.
And that's the cost of ideology that Flynn's warning us about. It steals our capacity for surprise. If nothing can surprise you, you've stopped encountering reality.
That's such a haunting thought. A world without surprise. Maybe that's why genuine curiosity feels almost rebellious now. When you ask an honest question in a polarized space, you're breaking a taboo.
Exactly. In an age of moral theater, curiosity is countercultural. It's an act of resistance.
So maybe that's the challenge we leave with our listeners tonight. This week, find one topic that makes you defensive. And instead of arguing, ask, what am I protecting? Not who you're fighting, but what inside you feels threatened.
Beautiful, because that's where real thinking starts. Not with answers, but with discomfort.
That's the essence of intellectual honesty. Flynn's book isn't cynical, it's hopeful. It assumes that truth is still out there, waiting for anyone brave enough to follow it without a flag. Next time on The Ideology Trap, we'll look at a case study that shocked mid-century America. Alfred Kinsey, the researcher whose science on human sexuality revolutionized culture and quietly rewrote the boundaries between evidence and ideology.
Yeah, that one's going to be wild. It's a perfect example of how data can be weaponized when a moral cause needs numbers more than it needs truth.
Exactly. So join us as we unpack how the pursuit of knowledge turned into a crusade, and how that story still echoes in today's culture wars.
I'll bring my notes, and probably a few raised eyebrows.
Perfect. And for everyone listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, share it with someone who loves to argue but hates to listen. Tell them it's not a debate. It's a detox. Thanks for spending this time with us. Remember, intellect is a tool, not a trophy. And humility. That's how you keep it sharp.
Couldn't have said it better.
I'm Ash. This was The Ideology Trap. See you next time.